term color line is going to come up again. We'll deal with it especially on Thursday. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to coin this term, the color line, in his most famous book, Soul's a Black Book. He says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. It's the issue of black and white, essentially, in this country and in the world. So we'll come back to that term.
So did they actually debate each other?
They didn't debate in the sense of sitting on the stage and like political debate in that sense. They're going to debate each other through their programs and through newspapers, through books. They really do go at each other pretty directly. For example, in Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, chapter 3 of his famous book is called Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others. So he's basically going to write a whole chapter like, look, this is for Booker T. If they were hip-hop artists, this would have been their kind of moment of beef, their kind of Nas sort of thing. They really talked directly to each other, but it really was a larger debate, discussion about education, about the race problem, how do you respond to it, all these questions that we're dealing with. How should you respond to Jim Crow?
So he didn't really like him, though?
It's hard to say. I think we'll get into a little more when we talk about Washington, because I want to set up Washington first before we talk about Du Bois' critique of him. But I think he has a healthy respect for Washington throughout. But he's going to disagree over tactics and goals. They're going to disagree heavily over their tactics and over their goals. And then we're going to see several of these debates in African American history. Think about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X later on. They actually have a healthy respect for one another. They disagree over tactics and goals, especially early on in their careers. I think a lot of that stage gets set in this period. But we'll come back to that because it's an important discussion. So you're asking good questions. Don't forget them. Okay. Again, some of this stuff will look familiar in the early parts of these slides. If you have these yourselves, I'll go through them sort of quickly. We've talked about, preventing voting legally, right? There are going to be legal mechanisms used to stop African Americans from voting, even though the 15th Amendment is a de jure right? It's on the books. There are various mechanisms we talked about that are going to stop people from voting. Again, ultimately, what we're going to get from this, think about being the Booker T. Washington, think about being the W.E.B. Du Bois, and deciding, okay, how should we respond to this? Now, we need to know what we're responding to. One of the things they're responding to is lynching. That's why we spend so much time looking at that. Another thing is disfranchisement. Rise of conservative Democrats. We've talked about how the Democratic Party in the South is going to rise again. Pro-business climate, a variety of means to prevent the black vote, both formal and informal means. Right, so you're going to get changes to the laws ultimately that take away voting, but you also have groups like the Klan that take away voting. Poll taxes, we talked about that. Literacy tests, we talked about those. Complicated ballots, right? Just basically messing with people as they come and try to vote. Gerrymandering, the political scientists will know this term. Basically, what know what that word means? Gerrymandering. What's that mean?
It's kind of like you split votes depending on the area you live in.
Yeah. And it's really manipulating the map based on voting. So if you have, say, Bowie, what's the city? There's a city right next to Bowie. I live in Laurel now, so I'll use that 9 miles away, 8 miles away. Say Bowie is majority white, but Laurel is majority black. You find a way to kind of carve the political map so that voting is, say, limited or works in your favor. So if you look at even political maps today, sometimes you'll see instead of like nice squares of District 1, District 2, District 3, they've redrawn the map in several places so it'll look like that district is that way, that include these people or to exclude these people. Some politicians have used that historically, usually for racial means, to try to keep themselves in power. So it's basically redrawing political districts to ensure that you win the election. It's technically illegal. You're not supposed to do that. But people have found ways to do it historically, especially in this period. So all of a sudden, say you're in South Carolina, and say in Charleston, South Carolina, it's 70% black, but the rest of the state is majority white. You find a way to limit that district. Maybe they get 1 representative, but then you have 28 representatives in the rest of the state. So really that one district has no power. It's a way of kind of manipulating the political system. All these things are used to manipulate the political system. Black reappearance in politics. With black republicanism gone, disputes between white classes appear. It's another good use of our imagined community concept. Once you remove African Americans as kind of viable voters, whites start having conflicts among themselves. So the white working class says, hey, maybe wealthy whites aren't doing things that are in our interest as working class people. Start seeing splits. So some of what comes up in chapter 12 are some of these splits within the white community. Imagine community works that way as well. Maybe your working class identity becomes just as important as your white identity. Maybe because of the fact you're a woman, you don't feel like men are representing your interests. It could be their own sort of imagined community in that sense. Poor whites start to distrust conservative Democrats. And they probably had reason to. It's an important picture from the chapter in the period. As a rural black man, quote, freely exercises his right to vote. So he's going near the ballot box here, but you sort of see the intimidation and the threats, people watching. You know, obviously that's going to impact his vote and his safety. Economic depression caused farmers to organize against the New South proponents of business and industry. Remember, what's happening in a larger country is going to impact African Americans as well. So there are several depressions in the late 19th century, or recessions, 1873, 1893. And once that happens, not only is the whole country impacted, but African Americans are impacted as well. What's interesting in this moment, especially by the 1880s, 1890s, there are some instances of racial cooperation. So we're talking about how bad things are getting, lynching, all this stuff. There seem to be these moments where interracial cooperation might be possible. What do we mean? There seem to be these moments when poor whites kind of figure out that they might have more in common with poor blacks than they do with rich whites. Say a poor farmer, poor white farmer, starts to figure out he may have more in common with a poor black sharecropper working next to him than with the person that owns the land that both of them are working on. So it's a really interesting moment because race and class are in competition. We've seen this before. Think about the whole indentured servitude thing. Right? So those servants say, hey, let's run away together. Doesn't matter if you're black or white. We're both workers. Start to see moments of that seem possible in this period. Readjuster Party emphasized economic interests instead of racial differences, and it leads to a whole radical kind of farmer movement. A number of organizations of farmers are going to develop in this period. And again, it seems like interracial cooperation might be possible. And the chapter talks a lot about this, but I'll just say a little bit about it. Radical agrarian movement, that's what they're talking about, these radical farmers kind of coming together across this color line, at least temporarily. Black and white farmers drift together under radical agrarianism. Colored Farmers National Alliance. So there was a Farmers National Alliance, and there was a Colored Farmers National Alliance. First, blacks aren't allowed to join the Farmers National Alliance, but they form their own, and then ultimately they're going to be able to work with farmers. So farmers are starting to come together. They're starting to challenge big business. They're starting to challenge big farm ownerships and try to find other ways to improve their conditions. This is seen as radical. This is always a very radical moment when working class people come together and start challenging those that own the means of production, essentially. That scares folks. That scares folks. It leads to the creation of a populist party. These farmers say not only is it enough to, say, pool all our agriculture together and sell it for a better price, to challenge maybe the railroad industry or whatnot, but maybe we can form our own political party too. Maybe we can form a political party that's going to do things in the interest of farmers. Populist party is going to be that. The populist party becomes that for farmers. This shows the political agency of these farmers. And again, these populists, at least early on, seek to win the black vote. There's white and blacks coming together and saying, hey, we can change our society if we just vote together in our own interests. Tom Watson is a good example of this. He's going to be a leader, a populist leader, white guy, but very friendly to African American farmers as well as white farmers. Early on, Tom Watson is a good example because he shows how things are going to shift. Early on, Tom Watson is very willing to work with these white farmers. He says, black farmers. He says, let's bring everybody in. Everybody that's a farmer. We have something in common, imagine community. Really an imagined community of farmers. They start doing things like talking about cooperative farms. Okay, you're a small farmer. Well, you don't get very good price for your cotton if you only have 2 acres. But if we, all 100 farmers in this area, pool our stuff, sell it on the open market, ship it ourselves, We'll stop getting ripped off by the railroads. We'll stop getting ripped off. So think about the class identity here. Later on, though, Tom Watson and others are going to turn their back on black farmers. Tom Watson goes from being very friendly to African Americans to being one of the more overtly racist folks, unfortunately. By the late 1890s, he's doing all the kind of race-baiting sort of things that others are doing. So Watson is a good example in his own career. And he does it because it's successful. Right? Later on, he's more popular by being racist than he was by working with African Americans. But early on, there were some successful coalitions. These populists can find old members of the Republican Party that still are around. Right? They're able to challenge the political system. They actually run folks for office, People's Party, Populist Party, by the 1890s. Able to open up voting to blacks in North Carolina in 1894. North Carolina is an interesting state. You'll read a lot about that in the chapter. Reconstruction kind of lingers there a little longer. We talked about how Reconstruction ends by the 1870s. You still have African Americans in power in North Carolina later, well into the 1890s, in fact. Then there's a huge race riot in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. And a lot of these folks are going to get kicked out of power, very bloody race riot. So Reconstruction ends kind of later there, many have said. After the collapse of the agrarian revolt, both white and black factions agreed on the need to disfranchise black voters. So after this revolt of farmers collapses, wealthier whites and working class whites kind of agreed to come together around race rather than around class. And so blacks are going to be kind of kicked out of that movement at that point. Disfranchised. Some disagree on the methods of disfranchisement. So how should you remove the vote from these black farmers? Well, poor whites are going to have to be concerned. Well, if you give them literacy tests to get rid of the black vote, that may also take away the vote of poor whites. So poor whites are like, wait, we don't want to do that. Let's do it around race. So you start to see things like the white primary. Only whites can vote in the primary. Rather than literacy tests or poll taxes or something that may also disfranchise poor whites. The Mississippi Plan is one example. It's a suffrage amendment with the purpose of disfranchisement. It's going to set the precedent for other states. This comes up a bit in the Rise and Fall of Jim Crow video around, we'll see him in a second, that guy's name I'm forgetting right now. Mississippi essentially comes up with his own way of removing African Americans, and it's going to have a lot to do with poll taxes, ultimately an all-white primary, disqualification for convicts, requiring persons to read and understand the state constitution. South Carolina, this guy Pitchfork Ben Tillman was another sort of overt racist figure that would use race to separate black and white. Isaiah Montgomery, that's what his name I was trying to remember. Isaiah Montgomery, if you saw the Rise and Fall of Jim Crow video, volume 1, he appears there. He founds the town of Mount Bayou. He founds this all-black town in Mississippi. Think about Imagine Community there. It's an all-black town. They said, okay, we can't get respect, we can't get equal rights in the rest of Mississippi. Let's found our own town. And it's doing well. They have their own, police forces, their own city hall, their own parks. Isaiah Montgomery is actually becoming fairly powerful. He gets invited to this Mississippi primary and is going to vote in favor of this all-white primary. A lot of folks say he's going to sell out African Americans at this moment because he says, well, a white primary is okay. From Isaiah Montgomery's perspective, he says, you know what, these are rights we didn't have anyway. I didn't really sign it. I didn't really give anything away. We never really had this power. So all I did was get some privileges, perhaps, by kind of signing off on what was already going on. Now, this is going to be interesting when we think about how Booker T. Washington might think of something like this, right? Are you responding to realistic circumstances, or are you going to try to change those circumstances? How do people respond? Some are going to bitterly denounce racism. Others may try to find ways to work around it, or work within it. By 1910, blacks were effectively disfranchised in all these states. Right, so it seems to be working in terms of removing blacks from the political system, exercising their ability to vote in North Carolina, Alabama, Virginia, Georgia, Oklahoma. the white primary, that's what I was talking about, excluded blacks by party rules. So only whites essentially can participate in the political process, can hold positions of power, and ultimately can vote. And once you can't vote, why should a politician listen to you? Right? Politicians respond to their constituents. This is some photos from that 1898 riot in Wilmington that I mentioned. Blacks fought unsuccessfully to defend themselves in Wilmington. Politicians are removed from office. They talked about the river running red with blood. So many African Americans got killed and thrown into the river in the 1898 riot in North Carolina. They couldn't count the essential. Very bloody affair. It really was kind of the end of what they call fusion politics in North Carolina. Blacks and whites had been working together in North Carolina, but this comes to an end, particularly using very racist images and threatening lynching and these sorts of things. Another picture by Thomas Nast. We saw him in chapter 11, very famous cartoonist. You can see him talking about these folks kind of making peace on the backs of African Americans, right? Worse than slavery, it says here. So we're moving into a position that some people say is the low point of African American history. 30 years after slavery is over, some say this is the low point. Legalizing segregation. The Plessy versus Ferguson case. This date is not actually correct. That case was decided in 1896. Who knows what the Plessy versus Ferguson case was? We mentioned this before when we looked at the Reconstruction outline. It's kind of the end of that outline. Plessy versus Ferguson.
So it was where somebody who was 7/8 white, like partially black, got on the bus, and basically told me he got sent to black section.
Exactly. It's kind of like the math comes into it, right? 7/8 white or 1/8 black. Homer Plessy was his name in New Orleans, and he sits on the train in the white section. Looks white, but this is a violation of the law. This is a violation of the law because, again, it's not about how you look. It's the social construction of race. People in that area know that he has this 1/8 black blood, and so he's violating the law. Actually, local activists are kind of using this, right? In some ways, they're heightening the contradiction. They're saying, look, this guy looks white. Blonde hair, blue-eyed guy. He's the perfect one to kind of test this law. Thrown out, sues. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The attempt is to overturn Jim Crow by using the courts. Groups like the NAACP are going to do this throughout the 20th century. Goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and he loses. The Supreme Court says, no, we don't have to have everybody together as long as you have accommodations that are, quote, separate but equal. So the court feels like they're doing something just. They say, okay, we're supposed to be separate as long as they're equal. One hotel here for African Americans, one hotel here for whites. One drinking fountain here for African Americans, one drinking fountain here for whites. In school, you get the point. And they'll be equal, right? We'll all sing Kumbaya. Now, of course, they're never equal, right? The white schools get money, black schools don't. Black drinking fountain doesn't work. Schools don't have books, these sorts of things. So it's never going to be an equal thing. And this is going to take several decades to overturn this court case. But remember, think about the significance. This is not just a local courthouse in Mississippi. This is the Supreme Court of the United States. So separate but equal, or Jim Crow, is now the law of the land in 1896. Everywhere, not just in the South, in the North, New York City, in the West. This is a national law. White man's country, insider and outsider status based on racial identity and sanctioned by the legal process. So essentially that's what the law is saying. Again, you can think about imagined community in this way. Insider, outsider, right? Everybody outside of the community. What it's doing is it's giving a legal value to this category of whiteness. If you can fit into this category, it's worth something to you. So when you start thinking about why folks are going to defend that category so strongly, it's worth something to them. It literally changes your life chances. Public space considered white private property, and anyone who wants to attack that is seen as attacking the country in a sense. Segregated transportation evoked the most notable challenges to Jim Crow. This is often where we're going to see, public transportation is often where we see all these civil rights challenges. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott. Because this is where people are coming together. most of the country is fairly segregated residentially, right? You live in a black neighborhood or you live in a white neighborhood. And in this period, class is a little more fluid. So, for example, in the black community in 1895, you find a doctor living next to a lawyer, living next to a garbage man, because they're all African American. They have to live in the same neighborhood. You're not allowed these other neighborhoods. So what's going to happen is you get an imagined community formed around race, both within the white community and within the black community. But when they do meet each other, say a black woman is working as a domestic in a white home, she has to go from the black community early every morning, get on public transportation, and go to the white community. Also on that public transportation are whites. So this is when people really start clashing. It's no coincidence that areas like public transportation and education are going to be main battlefields of sort of civil rights, because this is where people are coming in contact with one another. It's the handwritten decision of Plessy, the Supreme Court of the United States. This is a topic we're going to get into a little more later on. As people are moving, especially from rural areas to urban areas, from south to north, right, you're going to find new challenges. Find new challenges in cities, blacks in cities, especially as they start to congregate in cities. Rapid growth of blacks in cities, more economic and social opportunities. Now, why come to the city? Better jobs, higher paying jobs. Why come to the north? Jobs, mostly, educational opportunities perhaps. Again, we'll come back to this when we talk about the Great Migration. Employment in unions, difficult for blacks to find jobs and join unions. Most unions don't allow African Americans to join. So if you're, say, a plumber, right, to be a part of the union is a sense of empowerment. You get better pay, protection, these sorts of things, but most African Americans are not allowed. Housing, difficulty finding housing, exaggerated by segregation, creates congestion. So if you move to New York City, you have to go to the black section of town and find a place to live. It's the only place you're allowed to live legally. And, for safety reasons. This creates congestion. You start to get slum conditions, tenements, right, and poor conditions. So we'll talk about some of those urban issues that develop in this period. We just talked about Jim Crow a bit, right? Jim Crow streetcars brought on black boycotts and protests. Black women are going to play a primary role. We'll come back to this too later on by around World War II. Women in particular are going to play an important role for the reason I just said. Most domestics were black women. So most, the people working in white homes were black women. So they got to get to the white community somehow. Therefore, they're on public transportation. And in some ways, they're necessary. So it's actually interesting. You find a lot of white women who employed black women in their homes fighting against segregation on the street. They're like, look, they got to get here to work. Who's going to take care of my kids? That's what's really, you're going to find some really interesting alliances in this period that we'll come back to. Now, this is where the chapter starts to shift to foreign policy. Foreign policy and some of the issues that we raised a second ago, the Spanish-American War in particular, the U.S. expanding and changing its role globally, right? Starting to think of itself as equal to European nations, starting to think of itself as an empire. So the U.S. is going to expand. The U.S. is going to expand. There's a very important concept, famous phrase in American history called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. Basically, manifest destiny is this idea that America is going to be this great nation, even before we were, and that we're going to spread. Right? Spread west. The idea of going west, right? And we start off as 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard, slowly kind of move. Louisiana Purchase doubles the size of the country. That's more west, more and more west. Eventually, the idea is we're going to get to California. We do that by 1850. And so we see the shining sea. Now, some people say, well, why does manifest destiny have to stop there? So by the 1890s, you start to hear that phrase again, and people are thinking along, maybe we should spread beyond the oceans. Maybe we should have a larger empire. And this happens in the 1890s. Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico are all going to be areas of concern, and other areas of concern as well. So U.S. imperialist ambitions focus on lands and resources of the world's darker-skinned peoples. Some say a nation has to be an empire if it's going to maintain itself. You need things like raw materials, which can be taken from other places and exploited. Scramble for Africa. So the United States growing into an empire kind of occurs against the backdrop of Europe involving itself in Africa more than ever before. In particular, in 1884, you'll read about in the chapter something called the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference, 1884. Basically, what happens in 1884 in Berlin, in Germany, is the various European powers sit down at a table with a map of Africa in front of them and a ruler. And they divide it up. So, okay, that part, that's yours, England. France, you get this. Germany, you get a little something over here. And they literally divide it up. Sit down with a map, carve it up, and start to parcel it all out. Decide what areas they're going to control and exploit. Pull raw materials out. And colonize Africa. This is essentially going to occur through most of the 20th century. You start to get a movement for African nations that free themselves, especially 1957, Ghana does it, Nigeria 1960, Kenya 1963. So between 1884 and that period, essentially Europe is in complete control of the continent. And the various European powers are in control of the continent. So Europe's already doing this by the 1880s. In some ways, the U.S. feels like they're late to the party. Where are our colonies going to be? So it maybe helps explain what's happening in the 1890s in terms of the U.S. becoming an empire. What's close to us? The Caribbean. We get to Cuba, 80 miles off Florida, right? So maybe it makes more sense that we're going to devote our attention there. The U.S. increasingly interested in South America and the Caribbean, Cuba in particular. The sinking of the Maine is going to be a tipping point. Spain was in control of Cuba at that point. We have this ship, the Maine, which is sailing off Cuba supposedly to help monitor things. And we don't like the way Spain is mistreating the Cubans. There's all this stuff in the newspapers about we should help our little brown brothers, all this kind of racist stuff. But the idea was we should free them from Spain, right? They're a colony. We should free them because we were a colony at one point too. And then the ship blows up. In the harbor, our ship blows up. Everybody immediately blames the Spanish, and we go to war. Go to war with Spain. There's some evidence now it may have been a malfunction. It may have just blown up. But based on the tensions and what was going on at the time, it seemed like a good idea to go to war. If we beat the Spanish, Spain is on its way down by this point. We're on the rise, so we beat them pretty quickly, pretty handily. Derek said African Americans are also going to enlist in the army. Some are vocal anti-imperialists. So why might an African American join the army and go fight in Spain? Maybe they're anti-imperialists. Maybe they have been reading all the papers about how Europe had carved up Africa and how the world seems to be being taken over by the powerful, especially nations of color. So even though these aren't African Americans technically that they're fighting for, some saw similarities in their situation. This idea of being anti-colonialist or anti-imperialist makes a lot of sense to many African Americans at the time. So.
Could you also say though that colonization helped them too?
Help too.
The African nations as well.
Help them how?
When technology and medicine, things like that they introduced.
You could make that case that there's going to be some increased technologies and things brought in. The problem though is those technologies are brought in and it doesn't benefit them. So for example, if you find iron in your colony, in your Germany, right, you're building this industrial machine in Germany, you need iron and these other copper, all these other raw materials. If your African colony has it, you're going to go take it. That doesn't necessarily benefit the folks you're taking it from. That benefits the mother country. That's really the point of colonialism. You benefit the mother country. And that's, again, why we, as Americans, were so mad about it. We felt like, wait a second, why are we sending all this cotton to Britain? And what are we getting from it? Britain's like, this is how colonialism works. You exist to benefit the mother country. So you are going to see perhaps some advances, maybe in areas like education, maybe in areas like technology, but for the most part, it's going to be very damaging to the colonies. They're essentially enslaved. I'll give you probably the most extreme example. Belgium, small little nation in Europe, has very important colony on the continent of Africa, the Congo at that time, Belgian Congo as it was called. Precious metals and jewels and things might be found in this colony. Belgium wants them. This can make them a great power. Now they could ask folks nicely, hey, why don't you go get those diamonds for us? But people might say, no thanks, I'm good. Got some other stuff I'm gonna work on here, I got homework. Instead, they forced them. They essentially enslaved them. 1905, for example, it comes out about all these atrocities. All these newspapers start publishing reports about what's happening in the Belgian Congo. They see all these Africans, arms cut off, feet cut off. I'm like, what's going on? What? All these folks walking around with one leg and one arm. Or when you don't mine enough that day, the Belgians were cutting off arms as a punishment and as a sign to everyone else. Look what happens if you don't work hard enough. These atrocities ultimately would make it to newspapers, make it back to Europe, and King Leopold is kind of shamed and all that kind of stuff. But this is the type of thing that would happen under extreme forms of colonialism, because they didn't care about the people. They cared about especially the wealth that could be brought out of it. Now again, sometimes the justification was we're going to Christianize these areas, we're going to improve them, and sometimes that may happen indirectly, whether you think that's a positive or a negative. But for the most part, it was about the benefit of the mother country in Europe. And this is why ultimately folks are going to resist it. It's also very difficult to resist it initially because of that same technology. It's hard to fight a tank with a handgun or less. And ultimately, it's going to take some time for these folks to be able to successfully resist, or to make it difficult enough that European nations realize it's not worth trying to stay there. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. In terms of the Spanish-American War, again, this is an interesting example. African Americans' role in it is going to be complicated in some ways. Black troops are treated poorly during the war, so they're essentially segregated. They're treated as less than, yet they're fighting for their country as they see it. They reinforce the Rough Riders, and Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Teddy Roosevelt's later going to be president. He gets helped out by African American troops, saved, some say, by African American troops. U.S. citizens not entirely in favor of arming African Americans or having them serve as troops. Remember, you give somebody a gun in your military uniform, you're saying to them you're equal. Right? Not only that, you're giving them a gun. Now, somebody you feel like is hostile to you, you might not want to hand them a gun. Right? So some are saying this is not a good idea. They're going to come back and be ruined. It's a picture of the 10th Cavalry. Some of these images are going to make it back to the United States, especially when you think about notions of manhood in this period. What better way to demonstrate that than sort of military service? Again, this ultimately is going to make the United States a great power. The victory over Spain established it as a world power. Treaty of Paris gave the U.S. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Spain's other West Indian islands, and the Philippines. There's even more bloody conflict after the fact, in Cuba and the Philippines, because folks there thought they were working with these American allies to get free, but then we essentially try to exercise some of the same control over them than the Spanish had. So in the Philippines, for example, it's a very, very bloody conflict after Spain has been defeated. Again, I'm not going into all the details of it, but think about how the color line abroad is going to impact this color line at home. Like, how do you make the case for kind of racism at home, and yet in some ways make a contradictory case abroad? Virgin Islands, U.S. purchased the Danish West Indies in 1917. Strategic and military importance. Haiti has always been a particularly significant place, going back to its independence. Remember, Haiti is the second independent republic in the Western Hemisphere, second to the U.S., but it's a black republic. It's a former slave colony that got its freedom. That's going to freak folks out in the United States when we still have slavery, because now you have all these freed slaves. That might be a bad example to the 4 million slaves in the U.S. Haiti has always had a complicated history. stemming from the beginning in part because of that. Liberia, American ministers seek to develop the commercial and economic life of the country, involve themselves in that area in very complicated ways again, for better or for worse, depends on your view. This is stuff we know all about, right? At the same time all this is happening abroad, you have things like lynching and race riots here. We've talked, more than enough about that. All this stuff is happening at the same time. That's kind of the point. Lynching, we don't need to go back into that stuff. Brownsville is an interesting one. Brownsville riot. This kind of maybe shows how some of this stuff could come to a head. Brownsville, Texas. There's a riot involving members of the Black 25th Regiment. So you have these black regiments training in Brownsville, Texas. They might go into town for some food, drinks. Folks in the town are not very happy that they're there. What's all these black guys with guns here? That's alarms going off. They get mistreated, attacked, and they fight back. Remember, these are now trained soldiers. So now when you attack them, they might have something to say about it. And they might have guns. They defend themselves, and they're going to get punished for that. President Roosevelt dismissed the entire battalion. Many of them are going to be brought up on charges. Roosevelt's criticized for not giving the members a full and fair trial. Remember, he had been saved by black troops in 1898, but by Brownsville, 1906, as president now, he's going to smack them down, essentially. Violence in the North. Some of these same race riots are breaking out in the North as well as the South, especially as more and more African Americans move north. Springfield riot, Springfield, Illinois, 1908. Black man is falsely accused of beating and raping a white woman. A mob began to destroy African American businesses. It's essentially a race riot. Lynched an African American man. Militia is called in to restore order. Okay, so you get some sense between about 1890 and 1908 or so, 1909. There's a number of things happening, both domestically and internationally. What I want you to think about is how does this all fit together? And how are the leaders, quote unquote, that are going to resurface in this period, how should they deal with this? How should they respond to it? Particularly someone like a Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is a hugely important figure, but he's complicated, very complicated. I want to spend some time dealing with his complications. I have a handout for you here. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Virginia in 1856, 57, somewhere in that area, which means he lived the first 8 years of his life as a slave. 1865, Civil War comes, he's 9 years old. So he has some memories of slavery, but he's going to be young enough to where he's part of this whole process of figuring out what is it that I'm going to do after the fact. What is it that I'm going to do after the fact? What I want to do is have you look at something. Just this first side. Born 1856, right, survives through the Civil War, decides after the war, like many African Americans, that the first thing he wants to do is get educated. So freedom for him is going to mean education, independence. And he's going to find ways to make that happen. His father is probably his slave owner. Unclear. In some ways. He's going to be, in some ways, the kind of quintessential self-made man. He's going to be the African-American leader between 1895, when he makes a very famous speech called the Atlanta Exposition Speech, and 1915 when he died. So for 20 years, he's the man. 20 years, Booker T. Washington is the man. What I want to think about is how he gets there and what his program is going to look like. So the first part of this is a brief bio, some background on him. We'll go through it quickly. His autobiography, Up From Slavery, in 1901, we'll talk a bit about that and look at some quotes from it, demonstrates his difficult educational journey. Most importantly, it outlines his philosophy for racial advancement through economic means via industrial education. Booker T. Washington is going to develop a program. He says this is the solution to the race problem. If the question is how do you respond to Jim Crow, Booker T. Washington says I have the plan. I got it. Just follow me, and we'll be okay as a people. And follow my life, essentially. I was a slave. How am I going to rise up from slavery? The main components of his plan were economics, economic empowerment, economic advancement. Get money. Get money. How are you going to do that? Educate yourself, particularly industrial education, what sometimes is called manual training, working with your hands. Booker T. Washington said, look, get a skill, you'll get a job, and then you can take care of your family and your responsibilities, and you'll ultimately get paid. That's how you'll deal with the race problem. Booker T. Washington says it doesn't matter if you're black or white, green is the only color that matters.
Roosevelt invited him to the White House too?
Yep. Washington is going to become so powerful, and think about this in the course of his life, that he goes from being a slave to being the most powerful African-American figure, one of the most well-known African-Americans in the world. He actually has dinner at the White House with Roosevelt. First African-American person to do that. There are actually, all kind of hate mail sent to the president because he dined with this monkey and all this kind of stuff. This was, crazy for someone to be able to do that. But think about how powerful that makes him. How does he do that in the course of his life? That's what we want to look at. Right? A lot of it has to do with this particular program he sets out. Industrial education. Industrial education. Now, part of that plan was industrial education on one hand, and as it says here, abstinence from political participation. Don't try to vote. Don't worry about the voting stuff. Right? Don't agitate. Don't make yourself a nuisance. Get a job, work hard, and ultimately you'll be accepted in the society. That was his sort of hopeful plan. And it seems to work in his life. Right? For his particular life, it seems to work. Booker T graduated from Hampton Institute in 1875. 1881, he's going to found Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee University today, Tuskegee, Alabama.
Is Hampton Institute?
Mm-hmm. Yep, down in the Norfolk area. He's going to become the most powerful Negro leader in the nation. Sees large amounts of money to support the Tuskegee machine. He would proceed relatively unchallenged until later development of Du Bois, who we'll talk about a bit next time. Skip down to where it says Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois, comparison of racial philosophies. Again, the question is how can the race problem or the problem of the color line best be solved? Look under Washington. For Washington, how do you solve it? Economics. What's the solution to the race problem, the color line? Economics. Don't worry about it. Get a job, make some money, and you'll be accepted, despite the fact that you are African American. Booker T would say this, look, if you're a carpenter, if you're the best carpenter in town, even the Klan is going to have to work with you. Say you're the best carpenter, you build houses, but you're black. Even the grand dragon of the Klan, if he wants a good house, he'll have to come see you. The Booker T says it doesn't matter, right? Race doesn't matter. Don't worry about all that. That's all foolishness. Don't try to worry about voting. Get a skill. Work hard. You'll be accepted. All right, so that's number one on his list, economics. Put number two, education. Now, they're really two and one and the same, right? Because the education was industrial education. You learn to work with your hands, learn a skill, a trade, right? And then ultimately you'll be accepted. For number three, put political social equality. He says on several occasions that seeking political and social equality is foolishness. It's folly. It's going to get you lynched, basically. Don't worry about that. Now, Booker T's thing was he said, you know what, African Americans are doing it wrong. They're trying to start off too high. He says, you got to start at the bottom. He had Drake CD back in 1895. We started from the bottom, now we're here. Maybe he didn't really, but that's what he said. Look, he said, you guys are trying to go to school, learn Greek and Latin, right? Poetry. You need to learn how to farm. And most of you are farmers. Why don't you learn how to farm better? Why don't you learn how to be a carpenter? What are you going to do with Greek and Latin? Booker T were here right now, he'd say, you guys are sitting in the class talking about me. That's not getting you no money. This school, you should be building these desks, not sitting at them. It's very much about producing something, a gospel of work. He thought work was important because it made you money. But he talked about work as labor is almost a beautiful thing. He talked about it like a gospel of labor. It was almost religious. You're serving God in addition to making a table. He said, we need to learn how to work. Blacks are lazy. Now, this is part of where people have problems with Washington. A lot of his writings and things, he would, he'd say blacks are lazy, dirty, they need to learn, clean themselves up. You need to learn how to brush your teeth. He said stuff like that. It's very harsh sort of message to African Americans, to the African American population. Some are going to start to have problems with that. But again, in his life, he says, look at me, I was a slave. Booker T, after he seeks freedom, they move to West Virginia. He would get up at 4 in the morning, go to school, to work in a salt mine, then go to school, then come back to the salt mine. So he educates himself, pulls himself up by his bootstraps, literally, right? And makes himself who he's going to become. It's going to be a lot of very admirable qualities in what Booker T. Washington is going to be talking about here. Yet, critics ultimately are going to arise. Again, I want to understand him, and we have to understand his complications first before we get into kind of the criticisms. Look at these quotes. It says major themes, Booker T. Washington. I told you about this gospel of wealth, gospel of labor already. He thought work was almost religious, right? That you need to learn to appreciate work just for the fact that it was work. Even if you didn't get a check, you needed to love the work that you did. Progress. He said we need to get on the train of progress. The United States is becoming a great power. We need to get on board. Don't worry about all this racial stuff. If the train is leaving, are you going to be on it or are you going to be off? Now, Booker T would say it doesn't matter where you sit on this train. Black section, white section, who cares? The train's all moving in the right direction. Just make sure you're on board. If we're going to make progress, don't get left behind. Don't get left behind. Service. Another key term and key word he uses a lot. You needed to be a service to the country. Make yourself indispensable to the country. And this is how you'll overcome racism. If they need you, they won't lynch you. Make yourself a service. Be a carpenter, open a store, right? Be necessary, basically. Look at this first quote, number 1, under major themes. It says, no race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. As much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life, I told you Drake, it's at the bottom of life we must begin and not at the top. What does that quote mean? What is he saying there?
You have to acquire skills. To become labor for you want to attain education, education and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, get a skill. Do something useful, something valuable. He would tell stories. Go ahead. He would tell stories a lot about African American family and in the rural South. He says, the picture is this. Right? You got a man sitting on the porch in a rocking chair studying, Greek and Latin. This tore down porch. The house is raggedy. The crops are out there spoiling, but he's sitting here reading Greek or studying French poetry. He said that's what's wrong with the race. They're trying to start too high. You can't be governor. Get a job. Get a job. Again, I want us to think about Booker T in complicated ways. So there's going to be we'll talk about this more, but there's a lot that he offers, and ultimately there's going to be several things that folks will critique about him. Go ahead.
I was sure if they couldn't that also be like how basically say don't look down on people who also have like lower jobs than you, like how people they look down on like people who like take out come get like your garbage and stuff back then and then nobody came to get it, your house was still there.
It's true. That's a good point. I mean, Booker T in many ways saw himself as a man of the people. He came from the lowest of the low. He was a slave, literally. He says, look, there's nothing wrong with taking out garbage. That's a beautiful thing. We need it. And not only should other people not look down on it, but you shouldn't look down on yourself if that's what you do for a living. Your money spends the same as anybody else's money. They what?
They make a lot of money.
They do now, yeah. I'm gonna make one deal here. Yeah. But yeah, he's saying, look, we need to think of yourselves differently. A lot of his message was for African Americans too. He said it was kind of the slave mentality, these sorts of things is something that African Americans have to deal with. So he's very harsh on African Americans, very harsh. So chicken jokes and whatnot, blasting to clean themselves, take a bath, these types of things. Now I want to complicate this. There is going to be a public Booker T. Washington, what he said publicly. There might be some other things going on behind the scenes privately. Might be. Talk more about that. Look at the second quote. No, we'll come back to that in a second. Again, his rise itself is significant. He goes to Hampton Institute. He's going to be mentored by a white Union general named Samuel Armstrong. Samuel Armstrong. This is where he learns about manual training, pull yourself up. He's mentored by this guy. He becomes like a father figure for him when he hadn't had one previously. Changes his life. He always talks about this guy Armstrong. And back it up a bit though. How does he get to Hampton? Booker T says, you know what, I want to go to school. After working in the salt mine, getting some basic education, he writes a letter, says, I want to come to Hampton. They say, come on, if you can get here, you can go to school, right? We'll work it out. He gets on some public transportation, gets a lot of the way from West Virginia to where Hampton is, but eventually runs out of money and has to walk the last part. Walks about 200 miles. Shows up dirty, raggedy, says, here I am. They're like, ooh, you know what? Says, I want to go to school. I know. We don't know. His entrance examination, there's a lady, a white lady, Miss Ruffner, I think her name is. She says, your entrance examination is to clean this room. You clean this room spotless. I'm going to come around with a white glove. I'm going to check everything. If there's even one drop of dirt, you're out of here. Clean the room right, you're in. Booker T's like that. He's big and span, polishes it up. Got Mr. Clean, all kinds of stuff. She moves furniture, is clean, checking all that. Can't find any dirt. She's like, okay, this guy's serious. So think about why you might say things like, learn to work. It's going to open up opportunities for you. Right? Don't be afraid of hard work. Gets into school, it's going to change his life. He's mentored by Samuel Armstrong. Eventually, whites in Tuskegee, Alabama asked Samuel Armstrong for a principal. They need somebody to start a school here. They had hired a white guy to start a school in Tuskegee, Alabama. He came to Tuskegee, looked around, he's like, I quit. There's no school there, there's no building or anything. He said, I quit, people here don't want it, I'm out of here. Sam Armstrong, they say, send us another, they wanted another white principal. Armstrong says, you know what, I got somebody for you. 1881, he sends Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington shows up at Tuskegee, realizes there's no buildings, there's nothing. Rather than getting scared, he says, okay, I'll build it. They literally build Tuskegee from the bottom up. Students worked, built the bricks, which they then used to build the buildings. So they literally build the school that they're going to go to school in. This shows the white community, the kind of white surrounding community, like these folks are serious. They don't need anybody's help. They're not begging for nothing. Not only that, they start making bricks for the surrounding community. They start making really good quality stuff. So even though the community is initially hostile towards Tuskegee and towards this Booker T. Washington, he eventually is going to make his way in, again, based on hard work. So think about how these messages come from what he had learned going through this process. 1881, he founds Tuskegee Institute. 1895, very important tipping point. 1895, year before Plessy versus Ferguson, there is a famous Atlanta Cotton Exposition, basically a big fair, country fair kind of thing. And Booker T. Washington is allowed to speak to the audience. Initially, he gets up on the stage, and this is a mixed crowd in the audience of blacks and whites. The whites are like, who is this black guy? What's he going to tell us? He gets booed. He steps up there, they're throwing stuff at him. He says something, starts to talk. And the more he starts to say, people are like, wow, this guy, people stop booing. By the time he's done talking, folks are crying, throwing flowers at him. This is the Atlanta exposition speech, sometimes called the Atlanta Compromise. He says several important things in this speech. One of them is here, number 2. He gets on the stage. Remember, this is a mixed crowd, black and white. He's kind of working the audience, right? He's looking at the black folks. Okay, what can I say to appeal to African Americans? He's looking at the white folks. And what can I say to appeal to these folks so I don't get lynched? He says this. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers. All things purely social. He holds up his hand. We can be as separate as the 5 fingers. White folks are like, yeah. This black guy is saying separate but equal is okay. Remember, this Plessy case is working its way up through the courts. Ultimately, it's decided in 1896, separate but equal. Booker T's already said it. He says we can be as separate as the. We're not trying to integrate. We're not trying to, take what's yours. We can be as separate as the fingers. But the sentence isn't over. Yet, one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. African Americans hear him saying, we can be one. We can be unified. Southerners hear him saying, we can work together to improve the whole region. Booker T had a way of speaking that everybody heard what they wanted to hear. Masterful in that. People love him. They say, this guy has the plan. He has the plan. It's the most famous quote. In all things purely social, we can be separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand. It's another quote from his autobiography, but also from the speech. The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly. So he's saying, don't worry about the social equality, voting, all that kind of stuff. Don't try to integrate, force yourself where you're not wanted with whites. Whites love this message. They say, this is great. We've been saying this for years. Now this black guy's saying it. Write him a check. And that's ultimately what's going to happen. And that the progress in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle. Now that sounds different. Wait a second. That second part, if you're going to get privileges, they must be over severe and constant struggle. Now that sounds like agitation. Right? It sounds like you're going to sit in and march and boycott. No, whites didn't hear that. They heard severe and constant struggle. Work hard. Get a job, ultimately you'll get your rights. Not now, later. Work gradually. Blacks here, look, he's saying we need to struggle. Severe and constant struggle. Booker T was a master of saying, reaching an audience. They called him the Wizard of Tuskegee. He's pulling all the strings. He hated that nickname, but that's what they call him behind his back. Wizard of Tuskegee. 1895, this catapults him to national prominence. Same year that Frederick Douglass, great African-American leader, had died, 1895, Booker T. Washington kind of becomes the new leader. Now, some say he becomes the African-American leader. He's kind of elected by whites, they say. Some say that. But he becomes the leader. People start writing him checks. They say, well, you're starting a school? Here's some money. We like your message. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, one of his better friends, writes him many checks. One check, $600,000. He says, Booker T, here, take this money. Booker T said no at first. I'm good. What he ultimately does is he takes the money and he actually gave up his salary. He no longer takes a salary from Tuskegee. All these wealthy white industrialists, business owners in the North send money to Booker T. They say he has the solution to solve the race problem in the South. He's the best thing we ever heard. Best thing since sliced bread. People give him many, many millions of dollars ultimately. Makes Tuskegee great and really develops his whole plan of industrial education. So Booker T becomes kind of synonymous with industrial education in this period. Now some of the problems that people like Du Bois are going to have, we'll talk more about this next time, is what are you going to do with all that power? What are you going to do with all that power? But I want you to think about the program, first of all. Industrial education, nothing necessarily wrong, with it at all. In some ways, right? Getting a job and you can feed your family. You can provide for yourself and for your community. Self-help, it's about self-reliance. You're not asking anybody else for anything. You're working for it. Think about how some of these same messages are going to stay with us. And it seems to fit the time period. Especially, it seems to fit this sort of time period of The rise of Jim Crow. How are you going to deal with separate but equal? How are you going to deal with the color line? Work hard. There is a preview of your first essay assignment on the back of this sheet. The first essay is going to have to do with Booker T. Washington. That's why we're going to spend so much time talking and thinking about him. Haven't gotten to all of his complications quite yet. So next class, we're going to pick that back up, and we're going to talk about Du Bois and others' critique of him. Ultimately, though, you're going to have to consider sort of the positives and the negatives of Washington and his program, whether, as the title says on the back of this, was he a sellout or a savior? Was he a sellout or a savior? So keep that in mind. This essay topic this is going to be your essay topic, basically. It's going to be a part of your midterm exam. This is a preview of it right here. We'll talk more about it next time, and you can get some, you can read it so you can have some specific things to look for, and questions and topics to think about as we're having this discussion. Yeah.
So Booker T. Washington was different in his personal life than he was in the public life?
Perhaps. There's a public. Some say Booker T. was a politician. Right? He said certain things publicly, may not have believed all of them privately. We're going to talk about that more thoroughly, so make sure you ask it. He's definitely complicated, I'll say that. Definitely complicated. Question?
Oh,
Yeah. Roll is other questions? All right, this comes up in 12 and 13 of Washington and Du Bois are in 13 as well, so that's where you should have finished by now. We're going to, again, get into some assignments. I'll give you some previews of those assignments now. In terms of this essay, next class we'll talk about Washington, finish Washington, talk about Du Bois, and I'll give you some more specifics on what you'll be asked to do moving forward. Other questions?